Thank you. I hope so. Good afternoon to all. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation to take part in this dialogue. We gather here to reflect on the impact of the Holy Father's Encyclical on care for our common home. Its message of stewardship of the natural world has played a central role in inspiring many countries to adopt the Paris Climate Change Agreement, I'm sure. It remains central to our preparations for the challenges of upcoming climate change COP22, as well as to the Convention on Biological Diversity 13 COP, which will take place later this year in Cancun, Mexico. In this spirit, I seek to introduce you to an issue that rings closest to the encyclical and to the message of St. Francis, that of biodiversity loss and the impoverishment of nature in its relationship to climate change. The Convention on Biological Diversity is a sister convention to the Climate Change Convention, was adopted at the Real Earth Summit and entered into force in '93. And it has three main goals: to conserve all kinds of biodiversity at species, genetic, and ecosystem levels, to promote that all uses of biodiversity needs to be sustainable, and to promote benefit sharing, so to ensure that those that are the holders of the rights over genetic resources and associated traditional knowledge, and that are the providers for the basic materials of coming from biological resources, benefit from the economic use of such resources. The convention serves as a recognition that the Earth's biological diversity and resource are a vital to humanity's social, cultural, and economic development, and that it is the responsibility of humanity to act as stewards of all life on Earth. The interrelated nature of biodiversity conservation and sustainable use and the enjoyment of human rights are reflected throughout the CBD, its protocols, the strategic plan for biodiversity for this decade, and its goals and targets. Of particular relevance also are the measures taken to ensure gender equality and the promotion of the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities under the CBD, including in facilitating their effective participation. The convention has been ratified by 196 governments, making it almost universal, with the exceptions of the United States of America, which has signed but not ratified the convention, and the Holy See, which has neither signed nor ratified it. Additionally, the parties to the convention have adopted two legally binding enforceable protocols. The Nagoya Protocol, which supports the convention to contribute to equity and balance between the custodians of biodiversity and the users of genetic resources, basically the scientific and the industry community. As recognized in the preamble of the protocol, public awareness of the economic values of ecosystems and biodiversity and the fair and equitable sharing of its economic value with the custodians of biodiversity are key incentives for the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. The other protocol is the Cartagena Protocol, which is designed to contribute to the conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity by promoting the safe transfer, handling, and use of living modified organisms resulting from biotechnology. The Cartagena Protocol reaffirms in its preamble the precautionary approach contained in Principle 15 of the Rio Declaration on Environment and Development, and recognize that modern technology has great potential for human well-being if developed and used with adequate safety measures for the environment and human health. Currently, parties under the convention and under this protocol are discussing the need for additional biosafety measures for the broader and more powerful new technologies known collectively as synthetic biology, which allows scientists to create completely new forms of life in the lab. In reflecting on God's creation and the outcomes of evolution, the message of St. Francis and the encyclical of Pope Francis, I'm convinced of the need to elevate the underlying concept of equity, which underpins the Convention and its protocols, by considering the full spectrum of values embodied by biodiversity, including environmental, economic, social, cultural, and spiritual values. When ecosystems are degraded and biodiversity is lost, this negatively affects every aspect of human life. The human condition is also impoverished. The great social justice issue before us is that those same vulnerable populations that rely directly on biodiversity for their daily needs and who contribute least to the problems of biodiversity loss, environmental degradation, pollution, and climate change disproportionately bear the brunt of these catastrophes. In particular, many indigenous peoples and local communities are already experiencing accelerated biodiversity loss and climate change, and their traditional livelihoods and lifestyles are under imminent threat. Small islanders communities have already produced the first climate refugees. Women and children from these communities are especially vulnerable. However, I also want to emphasize that indigenous peoples and local communities are not simply the passive victims of biodiversity loss and climate change. With their diversity, resilience, unique worldviews, traditional knowledge, and their close attachment to their traditional territories, they are valuable partners in the global efforts to address these challenges. By its own measure, despite current best efforts, conservation is still failing globally. Biodiversity on Earth continues its rapid decline. For example, we lost more than 50% of all the forests, more than 90% of all the wetlands in the world, more than 90% of the population of large fishes, etc. We continue to lose these ecosystems and species, particularly in the developing world, in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. The intensification and homogenization of agricultural landscapes have greatly contributed to the loss of genetic diversity, with corresponding declines in availability of plant and animal genetic resources critical to human nutrition, medicines, and climate change adaptation, and as sources of spiritual and cultural fulfillment. In the great oceans that sustain all life on Earth, biodiversity is equally impaired because of overfishing, ocean acidification, coral reef bleaching, marine debris, poor governance, and regulatory arrangements, and other threats. The rate of species extinction is now at least 100 to 1,000 times higher than what scientists refer as the background and historical rate of extinction before the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Human activities are creating the greatest wave of extinction since the natural disaster that whipped out the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. We are living through the early phases of the sixth crisis of mass extinction of living species in the history of the planet, this time caused by human activity. As with climate change, the action taken over the next decade or two will determine whether the relatively stable environmental conditions on which human civilization has depended for in the past 10,000 years will continue beyond this century. Beyond the reality of our own short lives on Earth and the immediate effects of the loss of biodiversity, humanity must embrace the intergenerational issue as well as the moral and ethical issue of species extinction. In the words of the Holy Father, every year sees the disappearance of thousands of species which our children will never see because they are lost forever. Because of us, thousands of species will no longer give glory to God by their very existence, nor convey their message to us. We have no such right. Humanity has a wide range of options, however, to address the crisis. Determined action to value and protect biodiversity can benefit people in many ways, including through better health, food security, access to clean water, and less poverty. It will also help to slow climate change by enabling ecosystems to restore and absorb more carbon. It will also help people adapt to climate change by adding resilience to both human communities and ecosystems and making them less vulnerable, and by providing the needed genetic resources to adapt the food systems to face the impacts of climate change. Agriculture is already starting to be heavily impacted by climate change, and there's no way we can adapt agriculture to climate change without biodiversity. Some of these opinions are explored in this encyclical, such as the need for developing an integral ecology, bringing together all aspects of the environment to create a new cultural ecology, combining the patrimony of nature with the historic, artistic, and cultural patrimonies, which are likewise under threat. An ecology of daily life through the ecological education, raising awareness of our common origin, of our mutual belonging, and of a future to be shared with everyone. Similar causes for action are found in the Strategic Plan for Biodiversity that is in course for this decade, starting with its first Aichi target, to ensure that by 2020, at least people are aware of the values of biodiversity and of the steps that they can take to conserve and use it sustainably. The encyclical calls for a common plan, but I would like to propose to you that the Strategic Plan for Biodiversity and its 20 global Aichi biodiversity targets, which are recognized as a universal action plan for the entire United Nations systems, which was adopted by the 10th Conference of the Parties of the CBD in Nagoya, Japan in 2010, and endorsed by all the other global biodiversity-related conventions, and also through United Nations General Assembly resolutions, is already a negotiated developed plan that the Church could embrace. In line with the encyclical overriding message on care for our common home, the vision of the Strategic Plan for Biodiversity is a world of living in harmony with nature, where by 2050, biodiversity is valued, conserved, restored, and wisely used, maintaining ecosystem services, sustaining a healthy planet, and delivering benefits essential for all people. Directly relevant to the mission of the CBD, the encyclical encourages implementation of sustainable and diversified agriculture, promoting better management of marine and forest resources, and ensuring universal access to water. Pope Francis' encyclical has engaged not just Catholics, but more broadly humanity itself, on responsibility and action for climate change and the degradation of nature. But I would also like to explore with you the possibility of a deeper response on this issue of biodiversity loss by the Church. Firstly, we should acknowledge, despite the limitations of human politics and the current limitation of the international governance system, that there has been significant progress in recent years in the implementation of the biodiversity agenda, though still not sufficient to halt the rapid loss of biodiversity, including ecosystems and genetic resources. However, we should also note that between actions taken and results, there will be inevitably time lapses. So it's an issue of scaling up the implementation. We know mostly the solutions, but the scale of the issue is so big that unless we significantly increase our efforts, we will not meet the needs. Reflecting on the actions outlined in the strategic plan and in the encyclical, can we explore what actions we can take together to address biodiversity loss? Can we explore synergies in our common messages and goals, such as sustainability, poverty, eradication, living within ecological limits, our relationship with nature, plants and animals, and more fully explore synergies between the Franciscan message and the goals and targets of the CBD? Would the Holy See consider acceding to the CBD and engaging in its debates and dialogues? What symbolic gestures and practical actions could the Catholic Church inspire its 1.2 billion followers to take concerning calls for sustainable lifestyles and more sober consumption patterns? Aichi Target 11 calls, for example, for at least 17% of terrestrial and inland water and at least 10% of coastal marine areas to be protected by 2020. Could we explore what this would look like if embraced by the Holy Church and applied to church lands, dioceses, and parishes? Can we explore the possibility of joint publications that could be launched at future International Days for Biodiversity on biodiversity and spirituality, for example? Can we co-organize with the Vatican partners high-level ecumenical events on the margins of future CBD and UNFCCC governing body meetings? Building on the Assisi's faith declarations on nature that started in 1986, what gestures and actions could the Holy Church promote in a strengthened dialogue on these issues with other faiths? In the words of St. John Paul II, a solution to ecological challenges demands more than just economic and technological proposals. It requires an inner change of heart that leads to rejection of unsustainable patterns of consumption and production. It demands an ethical behavior that respects the principles of universal solidarity, social justice, and responsibility. I stand here with you with the hope that one day these esteemed two bodies, the Pontifical Academy of Science and Social Sciences and the Council for Justice and Peace, can also pay attention to the political discussions which are ongoing on biodiversity, especially under the CBD. In closing, it is said that St. Francis of Assisi believed that nature is a mirror of God in all its beauty, majesty, and complexity. One verse from the Canticle of the Sun is particularly striking in this respect. Be praised, my Lord, through our sister Mother Earth, who feeds us and rules us, and produces various fruits with colored flowers and herbs. Saint Francis, Pope Francis, and the Holy Church, the world needs your help. The world needs the ecological holy grail for salvation of biodiversity. The depth and complexity of living nature still exceeds human imagination, and most of the world around us remains unknown, and such rich biodiversity offers a compelling moral argument for preserving God's creation. We live a crisis of values with deeply negative consequences for the ways humans relate to nature and to all other forms of life. The Holy Church is in a unique position to lead a moral defense of biodiversity and halt the sixth event of mass extinction, taking an ethical stance to restrain the ecological footprint of humanity and to ensure biosafety limits to human attempts to manipulate life on Earth in its attempt to play God. Thank you.